Hello, everybody. Good afternoon and happy St. Patrick's Day. This second video is going to focus on the lesson that I would have given yesterday in class about the late classical symphony, in particular the symphonies of Haydn and Mozart. And so this again will be a very, very abbreviated version of the one that I would give in class, but it will, I think, give you some good context as you're doing the reading in the Henning textbook about their symphonies and some material that you'll need to know for the midterm exam. So to get started, just to go back and review a little bit of what we were talking about before spring break, the fact that the symphony, although we tend to associate it with German composers, Austrian composers, like Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, the symphony actually originated in Italy. And we talked about the importance of Sammartini. I think really if anyone deserves the designation as certainly the creator of the symphony would be Sammartini. You may recall that his first symphonies appeared in the 1740s. They were only for strings with harpsichord, so no horns, no brass, no oboes, none of that. And they were in three movements. So they borrowed the same structure as the Italian opera Sinfonia, the fast, slow, fast three-movement design. After Sammartini, the next big kind of moment in the history of the symphony came in Germany with the so-called Mannheim School, and in particular the composer Johann Stamitz, who not only was one of the first to add an additional movement to the three, adding a minuet as the third movement, but also greatly increased the instrumentation, adding horns and wind parts, and just increasing the size and scope of the symphony overall. Much more dynamic contrast, much more of a formal style that is closer to what we now know as sonata form. As we move to the end of the 18th century and look at the works of Haydn and Mozart, we see that these two composers were incredibly significant in the development of the symphony and would have a big impact on the symphony in the hands of the next generation, especially Beethoven. When Haydn accepted his position working for the Hungarian Esterházy family, he was essentially required to compose on demand, whether it be chamber music, opera, choral pieces, and symphonies. And so he really put a lot of effort into writing these symphonies and whenever possible tried to provide an opportunity for the players in the orchestra, which was renowned as really one of the finest in Europe, to have solo opportunities. And so that's one of the reasons why you see, for example, a lot of wind solos in Haydn symphonies and so forth. His symphonic output, the standard numbering, is 104 symphonies, although that has been called into question. There may be a few more than that, but the standard number is 104. And they developed through several different phases. And we don't have time to get into all of the specifics of from the very first symphonies he wrote in the late 1750s until the final ones in the 1790s, but I did want to focus on a couple of periods in Haydn's symphonic development. The first one are the symphonies that he wrote in the 1770s, the so-called Sturm und Drang symphonies. I don't know how well you can see that. Sturm und Drang, which is German for storm and stress. So these are symphonies that were written primarily in the 1780s and were mostly pieces in minor keys, very dramatic in style, very different than what we tend to associate with the classical period symphony, the more lighthearted melody and accompaniment type of style. And the term Sturm und Drang or Storm and Stress actually comes from a play written by a playwright named Klinger. And so it became a movement that was sort of a predecessor to Romanticism, one that would be picked up by writers like Johann Goethe and so forth, who we'll talk about in a future episode. But so in addition to the minor keys, you see, very sudden changes of style and mood. There's a sense of turbulence in a lot of these Sturm und Drang symphonies. And so Haydn wrote a number of them, not only symphonies, he also wrote some piano pieces, piano sonatas, and string quartets in that style too. But we're going to listen to just a little short excerpt of the opening of the most famous of Haydn's Sturm und Drang symphonies. This is the Farewell Symphony, so it's Symphony number 45. A lot of Haydn's pieces have special titles associated with them, just like Beethoven's music. And the Farewell is a reference to the fact that Haydn's employer, Prince Nicholas, was often asking the musicians of the court to stay into their summer vacation. He liked to have all these concerts and so forth. And so Haydn decided to poke a little bit of fun. And in the final movement, which I'm not going to play in the interest of time, but I hope you'll listen to it, the final movement of the 45th Symphony, the musicians literally, after the opening section, literally get up and walk out, leave their seats one by one until only two violins are left on the stage. And so the prince definitely got the message and never kept them that far into their summer vacation as he had done before. So, but I want to actually go back to the beginning of the symphony and play just a little bit of the opening of the exposition of the first movement. So you're going to notice those things that I talked about. The minor key, in this case, F sharp minor, a very rare key in the 18th century. The drama, the drive of the music, the intensity of the music is very different than what we tend to associate with the classical period. So here's just a bit of the opening of the Farewell Symphony. All right, hope you listen to the whole thing. Moving on, when we get toward the middle and the end period of Haydn's life, so Prince Nicholas dies in 1790, and his successor was not nearly as interested in music as Nicholas had been. And so Haydn had the opportunity, and of course he was quite well off, he had the money, was interested in doing more traveling. And so he made a couple of trips to London in the 1790s, and was asked by a number of people to write some music, and so this encouraged him to compose not only his final 12 symphonies, which are collectively known as the London Symphonies. So symphonies number 93 to 104. So 12 of them divided into two sets of 6, depending on the first and the second visit that Haydn made to London. Although these have a lot of things in common with the previous symphonies, the Sturm und Drang style, they're in 4 movements. The minuet is the third movement, the slow movement is the second movement, as we would expect. There have been a number of innovations since Haydn wrote his earlier symphonies. First off, he uses a full wind group in virtually every symphony, including clarinets. He uses some special effects. The famous Symphony number 103 is called the drum roll because it actually begins with a timpani roll, which was the first time that had happened in the opening of a symphonic movement. And he also included, many examples of his representative humor. And so to illustrate that, we're going to talk just a little bit about Symphony number 94, which is known as the Surprise Symphony. So I posted on Blackboard a little handout about Symphony number 94. We're going to focus on the second movement. So it's in the traditional 4 movements, as we're going to concentrate on the second movement. As Haydn likes to do, his slow movements are often in theme and variation form. So we saw this with the Emperor's String Quartet that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and it's true in this piece as well. The surprise comes in what Haydn does at the end of the introduction of the theme. So this is, of course, a piece in theme and variation. So you have the theme, and then in this case, you have 4 variations and a short coda to close it off. And so I think you will notice, as I just play the opening section, where the surprise comes in. This is a piece for the midterm, so I'm just going to play the opening of it, but you'll want to make sure that you listen to the whole movement. So that's the surprise. So there are a number of different theories about what he really meant by surprise. And so the most common one that you'll find cited is that Haydn was trying to wake up some of the attendees at the first performances who had fallen asleep. Another theory is that Haydn said in one of his writings that he wanted to quote unquote surprise the audience with things that were new. So there's a number of different possibilities, but it definitely is a good example of Haydn, I think, really having some fun with the tradition of the symphony. Haydn's symphonies were incredibly influential, not only in his time, but in the generation to come. And so when we talk about Beethoven in a couple of weeks, you'll see that there are many parallels between especially the early symphonies of Beethoven and the symphonies of Haydn. And in closing, talking about the symphony, I wanted to say a little bit about Mozart's symphonies. Mozart spent a lot more time writing symphonies in the early part of his career than he did in the ending part of his career, and he was concentrating mostly on concertos, piano concertos in particular, and opera. But he did give us 41 major examples of symphonies. Again, like Haydn, there's debate about the exact number, but the standard numbering system is 41. We're going to listen to a little bit of the opening of Symphony number 40 in G minor. This is from a set of 3 symphonies that Mozart was working on in the summer of 1788. And this is among the most creative and active period of his entire career. He was composing music at a ridiculously fast rate. And so the symphony is a bit unusual in a couple of ways. First off, it's in minor. It's in G minor. Mozart only wrote 2 symphonies in his entire career in minor keys, both of them in G minor. So number 25, and then this one, number 40. Second is that the piece begins without a slow introduction. Most of Haydn's symphonies start with an extended introduction before the opening allegro, and the first theme is presented in the sonata form style. So Mozart does not do that. He starts right off after just half a bar or so of intro with the main theme. And as I play the opening of this first movement, which is another piece for the midterm exam, I want you to notice how frequently that motive, that little half step between E flat and F, da 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 da, is going to reappear, because Mozart is going to base the entire development section of this first movement on that basic motive. Unlike Haydn, who tended to be pretty experimental in his use of form in a lot of his symphonies, Mozart tends to stick a little bit closer to the textbook definition of what we think of as sonata form. In other words, what you've been learning about in theory class and what we've talked about in history a bit. So I'll point out some of those signposts in the form as we go along. All right, so we're going to listen to just the opening section, the exposition of Mozart's Symphony number 40. Notice we're starting to modulate. Move into the transition, sometimes called the bridge. The medial caesura, second theme in the relative major, so we're in B flat. Notice a lot of focus on the winds. Mozart will often have the second theme feature the wind group. Closing theme, still in B flat. All right, we'll skip the repeat of the exposition. So that gives you just a little bit of an idea. So if you go and listen to the entire movement, you'll notice when the development section starts, how often that little motivic idea keeps appearing, not just in the upper strings, but in all the parts of the orchestra. And that sort of obsessive focus on a single motive is something that Beethoven is going to pick up on, and is illustrated most famously in the opening motive of the Fifth Symphony. So that concludes this short, very brief introduction to the late classical symphony with just a couple of main highlights. And so I will look forward to seeing you in the next video. This is the last that includes material to be featured on the midterm exam. So I'll be in touch with more details about the exam very soon. All right. Have a good day. Stay safe. Wash your hands.